Let me rewind to the moment my life split into before the basement and after. I had been a senior archivist at Meridian Heritage Group for 11 years. 11 years of climate-controlled vaults, respectful clients, and the gentle rustle of acid-free tissue paper. I was good at my job, meticulous, patient, the kind of person who actually enjoyed rehumidifying 19th century parchment. But mergers happen. Budgets get cut. And one Tuesday afternoon, I found myself standing outside the Meridian building with a cardboard box of personal effects, a severance package that would last 4 months, and the quiet, crushing realization that I was 38 years old and unremarkable. The job at First Mercantile came through a former colleague named Diane, who had the decency to sound apologetic when she called. "Don't say yes until you hear the details," she warned. "I'm listening. It's a 5-month contract. The pay is $38,000. Total. Not monthly. Total." I did the math. It was barely above minimum wage. "You'll be in the basement of a building that hasn't had working heat since 1987, she continued. "The previous restoration manager quit after 3 weeks. Before that, someone lasted a month. Before that." "I get it. High turnover." "High turnover," she agreed. "But here's the thing, Clara. The owners are desperate. They want to turn First Mercantile into a boutique hotel, something with exposed brick and artisanal cocktails, but the Historic Preservation Board won't sign off until someone catalogs and preserves everything in the basement. Every ledger, every artifact, every sealed box that's been sitting down there since the Coolidge administration. You'd have total autonomy. No one will bother you. No one wants to bother you." I should have said no. I should have waited for something better. But I had rent due, a car that was making a worrying noise, and a stubborn belief that old things deserved respect. "When do I start?" Diane paused. "There's one more thing. The building used to be a temporary morgue after the 1918 flu pandemic. So, fair warning. My friends thought I'd lost my mind. We gathered at the Gilded Lark, a gastropub where the cocktails cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Mark was there, of course, Mark, who had been my work husband at Meridian, who now had a corner office at a sleek digital preservation startup. He ordered a smoked old-fashioned and looked at me with an expression of genuine bewilderment. "Let me get this straight," he said. "You're going to spend the next 5 months in the basement of a building that was a morgue, handling documents that are probably 50% mold and 50% rat droppings, for less money than I pay my intern? The intern who doesn't know the difference between a daguerreotype and a tintype?" I asked sweetly. Mark waved a hand. "Details. My point is—" "Your point," interrupted Priya, my oldest friend and the only one at the table who wasn't in the preservation field, "is that you think Clara should be climbing some corporate ladder instead of doing work that actually matters. You've said it before. You'll say it again." Mark had the grace to look slightly abashed. But only slightly. "I'm not saying the work doesn't matter," he said. "I'm saying the working conditions sound like a horror movie. Have you seen the building? It's a monument to architectural depression. The windows are boarded up. There's a smell. There's always a smell in old buildings," I said. "There's a smell," he repeated with emphasis. "Diane told me. She said the previous guy described it as the ghost of 1,000 wet newspapers." The table laughed. Even Priya cracked a smile. "Look," I said, setting down my glass. "Someone has to do this work. If I don't do it, those records will sit there and rot. And 50 years from now, When some historian wants to know what daily life was like in a Gilded Age bank, the answer will be pulverized cellulose and lost stories. I can't let that happen. Mark raised his glass. To lost stories, then. And to Clara, who will probably get tetanus. Tetanus and glory, I corrected. We clinked. They laughed. I laughed too. But I remembered that laughter later. I remembered it when the basement lights flickered. I remembered it when I found the key. And I remembered it most of all when I realized that the street outside the bank had been watching me for a very, very long time. First Mercantile occupied the corner of Main and Liberty, a 6-story Romanesque revival monolith of rusticated granite and terracotta trim. In its heyday, it had been the tallest building in the county, a boastful finger of wealth pointing at the sky. Now it was a soot-streaked husk, its ornate cornices festooned with pigeon droppings, its grand entrance doors chained shut except for a single plywood-sheathed side entrance on Liberty. The construction crew had been there for 2 months already, gutting the upper floors. I met their foreman, a barrel-chested man named Gus who chewed tobacco and seemed to regard me with a mixture of pity and bemusement. "You the basement lady?" he asked, spitting into a coffee can. "I'm the archival restoration manager," I said. Gus snorted. "Basement lady. Right. Well, basement lady, I got 3 rules for you. 1. Watch your step. The floor down there is half original tile, half hole. 2. Don't touch the fuse box. We had an electrician in last week who said the wiring looked like a spider's nightmare. And 3. He leaned closer. I smelled coffee, tobacco, and something sharper. 3. If you hear footsteps behind you when you know you're alone, just ignore them. That's what the last guy did. The last guy quit after 3 weeks. Exactly. He ignored them for 3 whole weeks. That's pretty good, actually. Gus clapped me on the shoulder with a hand the size of a dinner plate. You'll be fine. Probably. He walked away chuckling. The basement stairs were at the end of a long, narrow corridor that had once been the bank's service hallway. The walls were covered in peeling paint the color of a healing bruise. The air grew cooler with every step and damper and heavier. By the time I reached the bottom, my skin felt coated in a fine cold film. I turned on my headlamp. The basement stretched before me like a subterranean cathedral of neglect. It was enormous. The footprint of the entire building above, plus an additional 20 feet extending under the sidewalk. The ceiling arched overhead in brick vaults, some of which had collapsed into dusty piles of rubble. Cast iron columns marched in rows, their surfaces thick with rust and something that looked disturbingly like dried lichen. And everywhere were the boxes. Wooden crates stamped with the names of long-defunct shipping companies. Steel filing cabinets with drawers that had fused shut decades ago. Cardboard boxes that had softened into something like felt, their contents bulging against swollen sides. And in the far corner, a mountain of leather-bound ledgers stacked 7 feet high, their spines cracked like old skin. I stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long moment, breathing through my mouth to avoid the worst of the smell, that famous ghost of wet newspapers, but also mildew, rust, rodent, and something else. Something sweet and chemical like the inside of an old piano. "Well," I said aloud. My voice sounded small and muffled, absorbed by the brick and the dust. "Let's get to work." The first week was pure unglamorous labor. I set up a small workstation near the stairs, a folding table, a task lamp, my laptop, and an array of conservation supplies. Soft brushes, microspatulas, deionized water, and a HEPA vacuum that I ran constantly to keep the air somewhat breathable. I wore gloves, a mask, and a Tyvek suit that made me look like a beekeeper. The ledgers were my first priority. They were stacked haphazardly, many of them suffering from active mold growth and red rot, a degenerative condition that turned leather into a reddish powder at the slightest touch. I worked slowly, methodically, creating a triage system. Urgent, active mold, imminent collapse, moderate, stable but fragile, and stable, dirty but intact. By day 3, I had cataloged 67 ledgers. Most were mundane. Loan records, deposit slips, correspondence with other banks. But a few caught my attention. There was a ledger from 1893 that recorded transactions in gold coin, each entry written in a hand so ornate it looked like sheet music. There was a letter from a woman in 1910 pleading for an extension on her mortgage, the paper still smudged with what might have been tears. And there was a receipt for the purchase of 12 brass locks, dated September 13, 1892, the day before the bank opened. Why 12 locks? I made a note and moved on. The construction crew came and went above me. I could hear their footsteps, their shouts, the occasional thunder of something heavy being dropped. Sometimes Gus would appear at the top of the stairs and yell down, "You still alive down there, basement lady?" And I would yell back, "Still alive?" And he would laugh and disappear. At night, alone in my small apartment, I dreamed of ledgers. Endless rows of them, their pages fluttering like trapped birds. And beneath the fluttering, a sound I couldn't quite identify. A hum, low and steady like a cello string played underwater. I told myself it was just my brain processing the day's work. I was wrong. It happened on day 11. I had moved to the south wall, where the largest concentration of boxes had collapsed in a kind of sedimentary landslide of old records. I was carefully excavating a section of fallen shelving, metal shelves that had rusted through at the joints, spilling their contents across the floor in a jumble of paper and splintered wood. I had been working for about 4 hours when I realized the light had changed. Not the light from my task lamp that was steady, but the ambient light, the faint gray glow that filtered down from the boarded-up basement windows near the ceiling. It had been midday when I started. Now it looked like dusk. I checked my phone. 2:17 p.m. That was wrong. The sun shouldn't set for another 5 hours. I stood up, stretching my aching back, and walked toward the nearest basement window. It was small, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, set high in the wall and heavily barred on the outside. Through the grime on the glass, I could see a slice of Liberty Street, the curb, the base of a lamppost, and the legs of pedestrians passing by. The light wasn't dimming. It was thickening, like honey, like the air before a tornado. And the pedestrians' legs were moving too slowly. I pressed my face to the glass. A woman in brown boots was crossing the street. Her right foot lifted, swung forward, and hung in the air for a full 3 seconds before descending. A man in gray slacks turned his head toward the bank, and the motion took so long I could count the individual degrees of rotation. Then all at once the light snapped back to normal. The woman's foot hit the pavement at normal speed. The man's head completed its turn in a fraction of a second. I stood there, heart hammering, for a full minute. Then I told myself it was a trick of the light, a flicker in the wiring. My eyes playing tricks after hours of close work. I went back to the shelving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me through that window. Something on the other side of the glass. Something that wanted me to see. The collapse was on day 13. I had been clearing debris from the base of the largest fallen shelving unit, a steel behemoth that had once stood 8 feet tall and now lay at a 45-degree angle against the wall, held up by nothing but friction and spite. I had removed perhaps 200 pounds of rotted paper and splintered wood when the whole thing shifted. Not fell. Shifted. As if something behind it had pushed. I scrambled backward, heart in my throat, as the shelving groaned and settled into a new position. When the dust cleared, I saw that it had moved about 6 inches to the left, revealing a section of wall that had been hidden for decades. The brick was different there. The rest of the basement walls were the same uniform red brick, laid in a common bond pattern, mortar the color of old bone. But this section was darker. The bricks were a deep, almost blackish purple, and the mortar between them was white, not faded white, but bright white, the white of fresh dental enamel. And in the center of that dark brick, almost invisible against the shadowed mortar, was a keyhole. I crawled closer, my headlamp cutting a sharp circle of light across the wall. The keyhole was set into an ornate brass plate shaped like an eye, an almond-shaped opening with the keyhole itself as the pupil. Above the plate, carved directly into the brick, was a single word, veritas, Latin for truth. I sat back on my heels and stared at it for a long time. This wasn't on any blueprint. This didn't match any architectural style I recognized. And the bricks around it, the black-purple bricks, they were made of something that didn't feel like clay. I touched one. It was cold. Not basement cold. Cold, cold. The cold of deep water. The cold of space. I knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic, that this door, if it was a door, hadn't been opened in a very long time, and that someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it stayed that way. I also knew with equal certainty that I was going to open it. But first I needed the key. I spent the next 2 days searching. It wasn't a frantic search. I'm an archivist. I know that desperation leads to carelessness, and carelessness leads to destroyed documents. I worked methodically, expanding my search radius from the door outward in concentric circles. I examined every box, every drawer, every crevice in that corner of the basement. On the second day, I found the hollow book. It was in a crate labeled Miscellaneous Ledgers 1918-1919, a crate I had initially marked as low priority because the contents appeared to be water damaged beyond salvage. But as I lifted the top layer of sodden paper, I noticed something odd. The books underneath weren't water damaged at all. They were pristine, as if someone had placed a sacrificial layer of ruined ledgers on top to protect what lay beneath. The third book in the stack was different from the others. It was bound in black leather with no title on the spine, no date, no identifying marks. When I lifted it, it felt wrong, too heavy for its size, and the balance was off. More weight in the back than the front. I opened it. The first 100 pages were blank. The next 100 were filled with dense, cramped handwriting in what looked like pencils so faint, I had to use a magnifying glass to read it. It was a log of some kind. Names. Dates. Times. Subject A, 7:42 a.m., gray coat, limp in left leg. Subject B, 12:03 p.m., fair hair, blue dress, tripped on cobblestone. I flipped faster. The handwriting changed every few decades. Victorian script gave way to Edwardian, then to the loose cursive of the 1920s, then to the precise ballpoint of the 1950s, then to typewriter, then to a modern hand I recognized as belonging to the previous restoration manager, the one who had lasted 3 weeks. The last 20 pages were blank, but the back cover was thicker than it should have been. I ran my fingers along the inside edge and found a seam. With a micro spatula, I carefully pried open a hidden compartment. Nestled inside, on a bed of faded velvet the color of dried blood, was the key. It was brass heavy, about 4 inches long. The handle part was shaped like an eye, identical to the keyhole plate on the door. The shaft was engraved with tiny, intricate symbols that I didn't recognize. Spirals, dots, what looked like a stylized wave. And at the very base of the shaft, just above the bit, was the same word, veritas. I held it in my gloved hand and I felt it hum. Not audibly. Vibrationally. A low, deep thrum that traveled up my arm and settled somewhere behind my breastbone. I looked at the logbook again. At the list of observers. At the careful, century-spanning record of people crossing an intersection. And I made a decision that I knew even then I would never be able to take back. I closed the hollow book, slipped the key into my pocket, and walked back to the dark brick wall. The key turned with a sound like a sigh. Not a mechanical sigh, no click. No grating of metal on metal. It was a human sigh. Exhalation. Release. As if the door itself had been holding its breath for 132 years and was finally letting it go. I pushed. The door swung inward on hinges that should have been frozen solid but moved with a silken ease that made the hair on my arms stand up. The room beyond was not what I expected. I had braced myself for horrors. Bones, secret coffins, evidence of crimes. Instead, I found a small, perfectly preserved chamber, perhaps 15 feet square. The walls were paneled in dark wood, walnut, I thought, or maybe mahogany. The floor was laid with hexagonal tiles in a pattern I didn't recognize. Black and white, but arranged not in a checkerboard but in a spiral that seemed to pull the eye inward, toward the center of the room. And in the center of the room stood a single pedestal. The pedestal was oak, beautifully carved with the same spiral and eye motif that adorned the key. On it rested a book larger than the hollow book, bound in what looked like vellum, its pages etched in gold that still gleamed despite the decades. But the book wasn't what made me stop breathing. The walls were what made me stop breathing. Every inch of them, from floor to ceiling, was covered in photographs. Hundreds. Thousands. They overlapped like scales, pinned and taped and glued in layers so thick that in some places the original wood paneling was completely invisible. The oldest photos were daguerreotypes in small brass frames. Then tintypes. Then gelatin silver prints. Then Polaroids. Then digital prints on glossy paper. And every single photograph was of the same thing. The intersection of Main and Liberty. I stepped closer, my headlamp sweeping across the collage. The oldest image, a daguerreotype so faded it looked like a ghost, showed the intersection in 1892, horse-drawn carriages, men in top hats, a hitching post where the fire hydrant would later stand. Beside it, a tintype from 1904. An automobile, one of the first in the city, its driver looking terrified. Then the 1920s. Flappers, a streetcar, a newsboy hawking papers. The 1940s. Soldiers in uniform, a woman in a Victory Roll hairstyle, a blackout sign in a shop window. The 1960s. A protest march, signs on wooden poles, a police car with fins. The 1980s. Punk rockers, a boombox, a payphone on the corner. The 2000s. Smartphones, a food truck, a man walking a dog on a retractable leash. But the angle was wrong. Every single photo was taken from the same perspective, low to the ground, looking up slightly, as if the photographer had been kneeling. And that perspective didn't exist anymore. The basement window that would have offered that view had been bricked over in the 1950s during a renovation. I had seen the bricks myself on the exterior of the building. Solid. Unbroken. And yet, here were photographs from the 1960s, the 1980s, the 2000s. Someone had been watching, for over a century, through a window that didn't exist. I turned to the pedestal. The vellum book was heavier than it looked. I lifted it onto a nearby crate I couldn't bear to work on the floor and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as in the hollow book. Florid. Elegant. Late 19th century. September 14, 1892. The bank opens today. I have taken up my post in the observation chamber. The window is clear. The intersection is visible. My instructions are simple. Watch, record, do not interfere. I do not know who built this room. I do not know why the key was left for me in the hollow book, along with the first year's salary in gold coin. I only know that I am the first of what they call the observers. I pray I am not the last. Something sleeps beneath the intersection. Something old. Something that dreams in the language of footsteps. I have been told that as long as someone watches, as long as someone records the patterns, the sleeper will not wake. The moment the watching stops, the convergence begins. I do not fully understand, but I will watch. I turned the page. The entries continued day after day, year after year. Most were mundane. Weather conditions, foot traffic counts, the occasional note about someone who crossed the street in an unusual manner. But every few pages something strange. October 17, 1893. 3:14 p.m. The girl in the red dress crossed the street 7 times in 17 minutes. Each time, she stopped at the exact center of the intersection and looked down at her feet. The 7th time she smiled. Then she walked away and was never seen again in this neighborhood. June 8, 1918. 11:02 p.m. The streetlight at the northwest corner flickered for 30 seconds. During that time, every person on the street froze in place. Not slowed, frozen. A man mid-sneeze. A woman with her hand extended to take a cab. A child with a lollipop halfway to her mouth. Then the light stopped flickering. Everyone resumed as if nothing had happened. No one mentioned it the next day. No one remembered. April 12, 1912. I have recorded this day separately. The anomaly was too significant for the daily log. At 11:40 a.m., a man crossed the intersection. In the center he stopped. He removed his hat, a bowler, brown, slightly worn, and stared at the sun for 11 seconds. The sun was directly overhead. No one else looked up. No one else seemed to notice that the man was standing in the middle of the street, hatless, his face tilted toward the sky. Then he put his hat back on and continued walking. I followed him for 3 blocks. He boarded a train at the station. Before the doors closed, he turned and looked directly at me. He smiled. His teeth were the color of old ivory. I have not seen him since. November 22, 1963. 1 p.m. Major anomaly. All foot traffic halted for 6 seconds. 16 subjects frozen mid-step. Birds halted mid-flight. A baby in a stroller did not cry. The wind stopped. The clouds stopped. The light changed from afternoon sun to a kind of amber twilight, then back again. Then everything resumed. I checked the newspapers the next day. No one reported anything unusual. But I saw. I always see. I read for hours. The entries became more technical over time, more clinical. The observers developed a notation system, symbols for different types of anomalies, a color code for levels of severity, a numerical scale for something they called the pull. The pull, I gathered, was the sleeper's influence. When the pull was weak, the intersection was normal. When it was strong, time stretched. People froze. The street breathed. And the pull was getting stronger. The most recent entries from the past 20 years were filled with urgent warnings. The intervals between anomalies were shortening. The anomalies themselves were growing more extreme. And a pattern was emerging in the foot traffic. A pattern that the observers had been tracking for over a century. A countdown. December 21st, 2023. The pattern is nearly complete. The street has been counting the crossings for 132 years. It needs a specific number prime, I think, though I cannot be certain, and it is very close. When it reaches that number, the convergence will happen. The sleeper will wake. Or perhaps wake is the wrong word. Perhaps it will simply open its eyes. We need a new observer. Someone who doesn't know what they're looking for. Someone whose presence won't disrupt the count. Someone who will find the door by accident, as we all have, and who will then have no choice but to see. She'll find the door on a Thursday. That's how it works. Always a Thursday. Always late afternoon. Always when the light is longest. I flipped to the next page. It was dated 1 week ago. She's here. I heard her on the stairs. The last observer, the one who quit after 3 weeks. He didn't see the door. He was afraid of the basement. He never looked closely enough. But she's different. She touches everything. She catalogs. She will find the key in the hollow book. She will open the door. And then she will see. Tomorrow at 4:17 p.m., for the first time in 132 years, no one will cross Main and Liberty for exactly 90 seconds. The count will pause. The sleeper will hold its breath. That is the window. She needs to be at the basement window. She needs to watch. And she must not blink. I looked at my phone. 3:45 a.m. I had been in the observation chamber for nearly 12 hours. Outside, beyond the bricked-up window that shouldn't exist, the sky was starting to lighten. Tomorrow, no, today at 4:17 p.m. I would watch. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat in the observation chamber, surrounded by a century of photographs, and I read and reread the logbook until the words blurred. I tried to make sense of it. A sleeper beneath the intersection. A count measured in human footsteps. A convergence that would happen when the pattern was complete. It was madness. It had to be madness. Some kind of shared delusion passed down through generations. A secret society that had built an elaborate mythology around nothing more than a dusty basement and an overactive imagination. But the photographs didn't lie. The handwriting changed over time, but the observations were consistent. And the key was real. It hummed in my pocket, a low, steady thrum that I could feel in my teeth. At 3 p.m., I climbed the basement stairs for the first time in nearly 24 hours. Gus was in the main lobby, supervising a crew that was removing the old teller cages. He looked up when I emerged, and his expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Basement lady," he said. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," I said. My voice was hoarse. I realized I hadn't spoken aloud in hours. "I need to ask you something. Have you noticed anything strange about the intersection? Main and Liberty? Anything at all?" Gus frowned. "Strange how? Time slowing down. People freezing. Lights flickering." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked around, making sure the crew was out of earshot, and lowered his voice. "The first week I was here," he said, "I was crossing the street to get coffee, around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I swear I stepped off the curb, and my foot didn't hit the pavement for what felt like 5 seconds. Long enough for me to think, I'm falling. Then my foot landed and everything was normal. I told myself I'd imagined it. But I haven't crossed that street since. I go around the block." I stared at him. "You never told anyone? Who would believe me?" He shrugged, but his hands were shaking slightly. "You want my advice, basement lady? Don't spend too much time looking at that intersection. Some things don't want to be seen." It was the closest thing to a warning I was going to get. At 4 p.m. I was back in the observation chamber. I had pulled a crate up to the bricked-in window, the one that had been sealed in the 1950s, the one that shouldn't offer any view at all. But when I pressed my eye to the crack between the bricks, I could see everything. Main and Liberty. In real time. As if the bricks were made of one-way glass. The afternoon light was golden, long and slanted. Pedestrians flowed across the intersection in a steady stream. A woman in a red coat. A man with a briefcase. 2 teenagers on skateboards. A mother pushing a stroller. At 4:15 the flow began to thin. Not dramatically, just a natural lull, the kind that happens when the light changes and people decide to wait for the next cycle. But I had been watching the intersection for days now, even before I found the door. I knew its rhythms. And this wasn't normal. At 4:16, the walk sign illuminated at the crosswalk in front of the bank. The last pedestrian, a man in a blue hoodie, finished crossing and stepped onto the opposite curb. He didn't look back. He just kept walking. The intersection was empty. For 17. And the street breathed. I saw it. I felt it. The asphalt rippled. Not like a wave, but like the flank of a sleeping animal shifting in its sleep. The ripple started at the center of the intersection and moved outward in concentric circles. Toward the curbs, toward the buildings, toward me. The manhole cover in the center of the street rose an inch, then settled. The streetlights flickered not randomly, but in a pattern. A sequence. A code. And then came the sound. It was a hum, low and vast, rising from the ground itself. Not mechanical. Not natural. Vocal. Like a billion voices humming a single note. A note so deep it was more vibration than sound. A note that resonated in my chest and my skull and the roots of my teeth. And from the cracks in the pavement, the tiny hairline fractures that had been there for decades, that everyone had ignored, a light began to glow. Not bright. Amber. The color of old honey. The same color as the bulb in the observation chamber. Then I saw the shape. It rose from the center of the intersection, from the manhole cover, from the ripple in the asphalt. It wasn't solid. It wasn't a shadow. It was a distortion, like heat rising off summer pavement, but vertical and roughly human-shaped. It had no features, no face, no hands, no clothes, but I knew, with a certainty that bypassed my brain and settled directly into my spine, that it was looking at me. Looking through the bricked-up window. Looking into the observation chamber. Looking at me. Its gaze was old. Older than the bank. Older than the city. Older than the bricks and the mortar and the key. It had been sleeping beneath the intersection for millennia, dreaming in the language of footsteps, and now it was waking. Not fully, just enough to open its eyes. The 90 seconds ended. A skateboarder rolled through the intersection, oblivious. A taxi honked. A woman in a red coat, the same woman? I couldn't tell cross from south to north, her heels clicking on the pavement. The distortion was gone. The light was gone. The hum faded to silence. But the manhole cover was still slightly askew. And I knew with absolute certainty that I had been seen. I don't know how long I sat in the observation chamber after that. Minutes. Hours. The light through the bricked-up window changed from gold to amber to gray, and I didn't move. Eventually I stood up. My legs were numb. My hands were shaking. I walked to the pedestal, where the vellum logbook still lay open to the final pages. And there on the last page was new writing. The ink was still wet. It was the same precise modern hand as the previous entries, the observer who had come before me, the one who had watched and recorded and waited. But the tone was different, calmer, almost gentle. She saw it. Good. She was supposed to see it. That was the final piece of the pattern, not just the footsteps but the witness. The sleeper needed someone to look, someone to remember, someone to carry the knowledge forward. Now she has to tell them. Not the truth. They wouldn't believe the truth. Tell them you found old ledgers. Tell them you restored the tiles. But start a rumor. A quiet one. Say that old Manetti's shoe repair on the north side is haunted. They'll go look. They'll see nothing. Then next Thursday send someone else to this room. The street is hungry. It needs new eyes every generation. You're free now, Clara. You've done what was required. You looked. You didn't blink. The pattern acknowledges you. But you'll always know the intersection is waiting. And one day it will stop breathing and start walking. Below that, in a different hand, smaller, shakier, as if written by someone who was very tired, was a postscript. P.S. The key belongs to the room now. Leave it on the pedestal. It will find the next observer when the time comes. Don't worry about how. It always does. I placed the key on the pedestal. It hummed once, a brief, satisfied note, and then fell silent. I left the observation chamber. I pulled the door closed. I didn't have the key to lock it anymore. The key was inside. But when I turned away, I heard a soft click from the other side. A sound like a sigh. Like a door holding its breath. I finished my 5-month contract. I cataloged the ledgers, stabilized the most fragile documents, and filed a report with the Historic Preservation Board that mentioned nothing about sleeping entities or impossible photographs, or the key shaped like an eye. I told them I had found a small sealed room that appeared to be an original feature of the building, containing miscellaneous ephemera of limited historical value. I recommended that the room remain sealed for preservation purposes. They agreed. No one asked to see it. The construction crew finished their work. The boutique hotel opened 18 months later. All exposed brick and artisanal cocktails in carefully curated vintage aesthetic. The basement was converted into a wine cellar and private dining room. The observation chamber, if it still exists, if the door wasn't sealed behind a new wall, is somewhere behind the sommelier station, next to the temperature-controlled storage for the Bordeaux. Gus asked me once, toward the end of my contract, if I'd found anything interesting in the basement. I looked at him for a long moment. At his tired eyes, his shaking hands, the way he still walked around the block to avoid crossing Main and Liberty. Just rats, I said. Big ones. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his face. But he nodded and he didn't ask again. I started the rumor the way the logbook instructed. Quietly, casually, over coffee with Priya, I mentioned that I'd heard strange noises coming from the old Manetti's shoe repair on the north side of Liberty. Just a passing comment. Nothing dramatic. Priya laughed. You're spending too much time in creepy basements. But she glanced at the intersection as she said it. Just a flicker of her eyes. A brief unconscious check. That night I dreamed of the sleeper. It was larger than I had imagined, not human-shaped at all, but sprawling immense, the size of a city block. It lay beneath the asphalt and the pipes and the subway tunnels, its skin the color of amber, its eyes closed. But in my dream its eyes opened. Just a crack. Just enough to see. And it smiled. I woke with the taste of ozone in my mouth, and the certainty that something had changed. The pattern was complete. The count had reached its number. The sleeper was no longer sleeping. It was waiting. Last Thursday I went back to First Mercantile. Not inside. I didn't have a reason to go inside, and I wasn't sure I could have made myself open that basement door again. But I stood across the street, at the southeast corner of Main and Liberty, and I watched. The intersection was ordinary. Cars. Pedestrians. A delivery truck double parked outside the hotel. Nothing strange. Nothing remarkable. Except that at 4:17 p.m., a man crossed the street. He was in his 40s, wearing a gray coat, walking with a slight limp in his left leg. He paused at the curb, looked both ways and stepped into the crosswalk. When he reached the center of the intersection, he stopped. He removed his hat, a gray fedora slightly worn, and tilted his face toward the sky. The sun was behind a cloud, but he stared upward anyway, his expression intent, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. The light changed. The walk sign blinked to don't walk. Cars honked. A cyclist swerved around him. After 11 seconds, he put his hat back on and continued walking. He crossed to the north side of Liberty, turned left, and disappeared around the corner. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding. Then I went home, sat down at my computer, and wrote this account. I don't know who will read it. Maybe no one. Maybe everyone. Maybe the next observer will find it in a hollow book somewhere, a century from now, and will know that they aren't alone. But if you're reading this, and if you've ever stood at the intersection of Main and Liberty, and if you've ever felt just for a second that the ground beneath your feet was not as solid as it seemed, don't blink. And whatever you do, don't take the job in the basement. The key is still on the pedestal. The door is still waiting. And last Thursday at 4:17 p.m., the man in the gray coat crossed the street again. He was wearing a different hat this time, but the limp was the same.